Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Thomas Porteus and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Thousands of people, primarily members of Generation Z, are marching in major Mexican cities to protest against widespread crime, corruption and government impunity. The demonstrations, which were partly sparked by the recent assassination of an anti-crime mayor, resulted in clashes with police in Mexico City, injuring at least 120 people. Now, to talk about this, joining us is González Ormerod. He is the editor-in-chief of the Mexico Political Economist. He's also edited and written for publications including White Paper, Rest of World, America's Quarterly, Hyperallergenic, Nexos and more. He also consults widely on political and economic matters across Latin America. Today he will be discussing the latest developments in Mexican politics, the economic implications of recent policy decisions, the regional political trends in Latin America and their impact on global business. Thank you very much for joining us, González Ormerod. Let's get straight into it. My first question to you is, what is driving the recent wave of Gen Z-led protests across Mexico, and how are authorities responding to this new generation of politically engaged youth?
So those are two different questions. The first answer is there are two main motivations behind the protests. The number one is the perfectly legitimate anger at what is going on in Mexico, the violence and the lack of security that has been going on for decades now. The other half is, of course, the fact that there is clearly a force behind the scenes that is pushing for this sort of protest. And this will answer your second question, which is that ultimately, I'm not quite sure that this is a Gen Z protest. There are a few young people, but you look at the demographics of the people actually marching, and they are by far boomers, older people, people who aren't actually Gen Z. You see the way the communication is done, how it's done. I think ultimately what you can conclude is this wasn't a protest by politically engaged youth. This is actually more clearly a protest by organizers who haven't quite revealed themselves. I don't know if there's anything too sinister. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the opposition in Mexico is very discredited, and so it often mobilizes in a covert way so as not to show its true colors.
Yes, and Alex, following on from that, another leading story coming out of Mexico, of course, would be the recent harassment incident involving President Sheinbaum. And what does that incident reveal about broader security lapses and the polarized political climate in Mexico right now?
It's a disgrace for many reasons, of course. The sexual harassment of the president is not only disgusting because of the fact that it is the sexual harassment of a woman, any woman. It is the president of Mexico who should have had a far more stringent security contingent, literally hours after the brutal murder of a very popular mayor in a different state. You have this man coming up from behind her and groping her. Completely unacceptable, both in moral terms, but also in terms of her security unit.
Yes, and of course we've mentioned about the killing of this mayor in Mexico. How does this incident speak of the law and order situation in the country?
Mexico is a very big country with a very complex system of security apparatuses, cartel relationships. And so when we talk about Mexico, we're actually talking about a series of different places. A really tragic stat that I like to tell people is that 50% of all the brutal violence going on in Mexico is concentrated in just a tiny handful of Mexico's 2,000 municipalities, which on one side means there are places like the Yucatan Peninsula, which is safer than Canada. You've got Mexico City, which is safer than New York or Washington, D.C. But then you've got places like Michoacán, Uruapan, where the mayor was killed, where there is violence unlike anywhere else in the world that we've seen. And so that's the enormous complexity about Mexico. Loads of violence concentrated in very, very specific places.
It's very interesting, and the United Nations has, of course, rated Mexico as one of the most violent countries for women in the world. We have seen many Mexican women now demanding access to women-only taxis and rideshare services. And what does this say about the current state of their safety? What is the government doing to combat this also?
Mexico, again, is a very polarized place when it comes to this. Obviously, feminicides are rampant, and they have been classified as such by the government. But there are also lots of interesting solutions going on across the country. Mexico is one of the few places in the world that has pretty much complete gender parity in politics. So more than 50% of the Congress is women, more than 50% of the judiciary is women, our president is a woman, and yet, to a great extent, that underscores the terrible plight of women, that even in these conditions where women are represented fairly in politics, even then they're under enormous threat in Mexico.
Let's now move on to the country's relationship with the broader continent. How does Mexico's internal challenges within the broader political and social shifts happening across Latin America, from economic instability to rising authoritarianism tendencies?
Mexico's an interesting place because it's bucked a lot of trends recently. As the rest of the world moves to the right, Mexico's left-wing government has consolidated. That worries a lot of people because they see the consolidation of a massive party, sort of reminiscent to India's Congress Party. That worries a lot of people because they say it'll become overbearing, authoritarian, and repress the rest of the opposition. The issue to me is, they've won it so far relatively fair and square. It's after years of right-wing misgovernment of Mexico that the left-wing government was introduced into Mexico by democratic mandate on a massive scale. President Sheinbaum, even though her ratings have gone down since this violence, is still an enormously popular president who can mobilize enormous forces to her. The issue is, I think, on the opposition side, a lot of the claims about dictatorship and authoritarianism actually come from the ineptitude of the opposition, which is not able to capitalize on a lot of the legitimate anger in Mexico properly. You can see it through how they've tried to jump onto these protests. So they say they're completely nonpartisan, and yet I only see partisan and party political representatives talking about it on the television. And so to me, that represents the fundamental issue of Mexico's opposition. It has a lot of people it can and should work with, and yet it is completely unable to, through corruption, through the fact that they've been destroyed at the polling booths, and they're still sort of recuperating.
Now, given current tensions over migration, trade, and fentanyl trafficking, how would you characterize the state of US-Mexico relations today and where they are likely headed in 2025 under Sheinbaum's leadership?
The state of US-Mexico relations at the moment is surprisingly good. When it comes to security, it's sort of shocking because you see US Secretary of State Marco Rubio coming to Mexico, and he is famously a very hard man when it comes to representing America's interests. And he came to Mexico to say that, bar none, Mexico is the best partner they have when it comes to security. So Mexico and the US are working very, very closely because they have a common enemy, which is organized crime. So on that front, I think we have a lot of positive work going on, a lot of intelligence sharing, and beyond the posturing, a lot of collaboration. The issue comes when it comes to trade. Trade is a big issue for the United States because it is woken up to the fact that China is nipping at its heels, not only in cheap imports, but also in high technology. So they're having to reconfigure. I think at first they thought from the United States that they could basically isolate and do an America first and an only America vision of manufacturing and commerce and services. They've realized that they don't have enough people or the capacity to do that, especially not in the short term. And so that's where Mexico comes in. Mexico is essential to the United States, not only because we send them most of their their products when it comes to manufacturers, when it comes to agricultural services, etc., but also in terms of security. The United States can't keep up with China's pace unless it's working alongside Mexico, which doesn't just provide cheap labor, which is the sort of classic excuse that people use, but rather specialized labor that Americans are simply not doing anymore. And so a lot of the US auto manufacturing sector depends on Mexico's, for example. It's not that you could get rid of Mexico, cut off Mexico, and then suddenly have a thriving US auto manufacturers sector. You'd actually get the opposite. You'd hurt them. And so I think that's what President Trump has started to realize slowly but surely, as he realizes how deeply integrated Mexico and the United States are. It's an issue he wants to deal with. He thinks some things are unfair, but I think he's come to realize that Mexico is a net asset for the US, not a problem.
Alex González Ormerod, thank you very much for joining us here on Focal Length. A fascinating conversation about a fascinating country. But with that, it's a wrap on this episode of Focal Length. For more international news updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.